All right, so we can start now. What we were discussing was essentially the background of the financialization that took place in US and also the globalization of finances. What we argued was the availability of a huge surplus, which was huge surplus and the surplus accumulating over various decades until the 1970s. And that was looking for the avenues of investment. And so what it required is a liberalization of and deregulation of the finance, and the second, the globalization of finance. Now, this was in some sense the assertion of the class, which is the class of financiers or the capitalist class, as we have identified, which came into effect. This class structure came into effect in the beginning of the 20th century. Now, we also argued that the supply side economics, with its emphasis on the reduction of cost to become more competitive at any cost, is something which very well suited this globalization of the finances. And also the fact that, the finance was playing a very important role in the domestic economy. So, and there is certain natural logic of supply side economics, which is basically that you say that, anything which actually increases your competitiveness, which means reducing tax, which means lowering wages, which means lower credit availability, which also means various different kind of subsidization. The subsidization subsidies are a very interesting thing. I mean, what exactly is subsidy and what is not is very difficult to monitor. For us, look at it, that an industry is subsidized if it is given cheap electricity. Industry is subsidized if there is a direct transfer. If industry is subsidized if it is given free land to make a factory. An industry is subsidized if the government actually provides higher education free to its students. Then those students become the labor supply. The labor supply naturally of skilled workforce will be actually higher. And for employers, they don't have to pay for that kind of training. So a expenditure on higher education is also a subsidy for the government. Suppose you have the Germany, you have the universal health care. In France, you have a much better healthcare system, almost free education, including free higher education, or very cheap higher education compared to US. Then that means the labor workforce there is getting subsidized. That is also a way of looking at subsidies. Anything which helps you, any act of the government which helps you reduce your cost of production is essentially subsidies. But what is actually advocated in supply side economics is one particular type of subsidies, which gives direct benefit to the industry. and not the other, which indirectly giving benefit to the industry because you are actually undertaking some of the welfare programs or the programs of free education and so on. So overall, this is the scenario. Now, what one has to keep in mind is that the domestic bourgeoisie, the big industrialists, which have emerged by 80s and definitely by 90s in most of these developing economies, you have the emergence of a class which is basically which is quite strong. It actually was dependent on state because most of the places had the state-led capitalism, except for China, which had socialism until the late 70s. I mean, the beginning of the transition from socialism to capitalism really starts in China in early 80s. Today, China, in all sense of the term, is basically your capitalist. But other than China, if you look at, then, by the way, the China by 1976, in 1940s, India had actually was at the same level. Three countries were more or less at the same level in terms of indicators like per capita income, education, health, literacy rate, and so on. These countries were India, China, and South Korea. And by the end of the 70s, both China and South Korea were way ahead of us. So it is not that under the globalization process this change has taken place. I mean, change was actually initiated. During the globalization, this gap has further widened. For example, by end of 50s, you had complete literacy in South Korea. By the end of 70s, you had, everyone was actually fed. I mean, they talk of the iron rice bowl in China. Iron rice bowl refers to the fact that it is a bowl which can never be broken. So no matter what, the rice is available, something which we are struggling to do even in 2020 during this epidemic. But what happens that during the globalization, the gap has further increased. My point was different here. My point was that we had what you see is that the industrialists in the various countries, they actually adopt neoliberalization, and they favor neoliberalization, transition to the neoliberalization, because the benefits that would be given to the foreign investment, they themselves would be the recipient of those benefits. And naturally, you can't have more favorable rule for the FDI and less favorable for the domestic investment. So naturally, if you give them some benefit, then there will be change, whether it is in terms of labor reforms or whether it is in terms of change in labor laws, that is, or it is in terms of various other kinds of subsidies and so on and so forth. So, in China, for example, I mean, it's export processing zones. So you have the establishment of export processing zones, which has different kind of infrastructure, which has a different law altogether, and so on and so forth. But, it can be seen only as a transition phase, because naturally there will be more investment in those areas, and those areas will grow fast, despite the fact that some of the laws and rules may not be in favor of the workers and the masses in general. There will be there will be huge amount of growth there. I mean, we know about some of the cities. What is that cities? City of China, which is the biggest commercial place now. Shanghai. So, the Shanghai, pardon? So Shanghai, they say that the number of high-rise building is actually many times more than what is there in New York. In fact, New York looks like a very small town in terms of so you have a huge investment in those. My point is that when you have such a growth, then the other areas would be actually demanding the similar kind of changes. So in some sense, what happens that you bring about certain changes, And those changes attract investment. And once that investment happens, there is a growth, and eventually that growth then leads to the other areas also adopting it. So the point is that this is something which is then favored by the capitalists in the domestic economy also. So it is not a I mean, the important thing to understand about imperialism or even the colonialism of yesteryears is that there was always a class of people which actually benefited from this process, and they played a very important role in establishing this imperialist order in their own societies. So this has always been true, whichever way you look at it. So it's not that it is a brute force which actually makes imperialism possible. It is never only a brute force. There is always certain allies you find in those economies. Now, this in some sense is the relationship between the supply side economics and the globalization of finance and liberalization of finance. Another thing that we spoke about earlier was basically the fact that supply side economics, on the one hand, gets its theoretical justification from the monetarist economics, which actually is premised on the fact that economy is always gravitating, if not at full employment, but there is a natural gravitating tendency of economies towards full employment through the market mechanism. And the only problem could be that there could be structural rigidities which does not allow economy to move towards full employment. But then those structural rigidities should be removed, and that in some sense becomes the basis of supply side economics, that you try and remove the structural rigidities. But then the supply side economics does two things. One thing is that it takes the two are related. One thing is that it does not necessarily then insist that the economy will always be at full employment level of output. It gets into the argument where it says that if you improve your competitiveness, then your exports will increase. But what is the need to increase exports if your economies are already at full employment level of output? So basically, it recognizes that there can be effective demand problem, but it says that the way to solve the effective demand problem is really not through any kind of government intervention, government expenditure, heightened government expenditure. Rather, one is opposed to it, and what has to be done is increase the exports. In fact, high government expenditure, which then means that you will have the high fiscal deficit, which is considered to be the worst thing that the governments can do about the economy. The government deficit being then leading to balance of payment deficit, and eventually the possibility of devaluation is considered to be a bad thing for if you want to attract capital and so on. Various ways in which this fiscal deficit can be actually discussed, but fiscal deficit in some sense becomes the real focus of it. By the way, all this while, one country which actually continuously maintains high fiscal deficit since the time of Ronald Reagan. In fact, during Ronald Reagan's time, fiscal deficit was very high in the US. And this is something which has always been known, and I think it's also quite beautifully argued by this new book by Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo that I think I had sent it to you. There's one chapter which actually talks about these things. So they maintain very high fiscal deficit, and the debt went on accumulating. But their case was different. They could actually print money which was accepted all over the world. In cases like ours, high fiscal deficit would then lead to essentially higher expenditure than the higher income. So if you have government higher expenditure than higher income, then that would eventually lead to economies to higher total expenditure compared to total income, which means that essentially you are importing more than you're exporting, which then leads to your forex problem, chances of devaluation of the currency, need for devaluation of the currency, and the associated problems with that. So this was something which, in some sense, remains something which supply side economics borrows from there. So that you basically, now again you see that the monetarism actually argues about the low fiscal deficit because it leads to crowding out. The supply side economics says that look, it recognizes the problem of effective demand. So and if you're recognizing the problem of effective demand, essentially you are saying that the economy may not be at the full employment, there may be excess capacity, and in presence of excess capacity there may not be much meaning of crowding out, basically, because if you produce more of X, then you have to produce less of Y, is an argument which really is assumes that there is full employment of resources. If not, then crowding out is not making any sense. So, but it actually adopts that thing from monetarism, that the fiscal deficit is going to be bad. So it's a mix and match of this. What is known as the supply side economics is a mix and match of various things. The peculiarity of it is that it actually gives the same policy recommendation as the monetarism gives. So, in some sense, this can be thought of as the real world monetarism coming out of the economics departments. When you see the monetarism, then what it looks like. So, when you are talking of Chicago or even Harvard, and then what is monetarism is one thing, and what monetarism becomes when it comes to IMF and IMF recommending policy becomes somewhat different. So this was the relationship between the supply side and the monetarist economics, which I thought that some of you would actually like to know about. Maybe we can, if you have some queries about it, we can address those things later. Coming to the fact that this kind of financialization, and essentially what is happening is that deregulation of finances happens in two ways. I mean, there are two aspects of it which have to be studied. Both have to be studied in detail. Something which we can't do in this course, but nevertheless. It helps us put things in proper place so that in future, when we know more about it, we can actually know that way to put it in the overall structure. So the first thing that is very, very important is the fact that you have the deregulation in terms of the financial instruments. So a lot of financial instruments which were not allowed earlier would be actually allowed. So you have a lot of derivatives. There will be derivatives on top of that. Derivatives are the financial assets whose value going up or going down really depends on the value of the first financial asset that you have. So if you have a real asset, real investment, counterpart of that is a financial investment. So that can be share or debt or something. And then you have the derivative, which actually its value would depend on some kind of mixture of these financial assets, or sometimes just the differentiation, the differences of these, how the value of the financial asset goes up and down, that will determine the value of the derivative. So I may not have the money to buy the shares, or I can buy only few shares with that money. But what I can do is that I can actually put my money into buying some derivatives, a derivative which tells me that the prices of this share is going to become 1,000 rupees after 1 year. So that's in some sense a bet that I have. And what it happens that so I am in some sense I'm committing that I'm going to buy this share in 1,000 rupees after 1 year. Whether I buy it or not is a different thing that we'll see. But there is a commitment that I make. And what happens that if the price of the share is only 900 rupees, then that means, but I have committed to buy it in 1,000 rupees, so I'm supposed to be losing 100 rupees. So I don't have to buy or sell the share. All that I have to do is that with whomever I had this arrangement, whoever has sold this derivative to me, I pay 100 rupees to that person. And if the share prices becomes 1,100 rather than 1,000, then he will be paying some amount to me. that 100 rupees to me. So in some sense, without actually transacting the real share, you can actually undertake an investment on the basis of the value of that share. So this would be one form of derivative. Derivative is a general word which is used for all kinds of financial instruments, which for which there is not necessarily a direct counterpart in terms of real investment. So that is how the derivative as in derived from other financial assets. So what it did, and again, I mean, those of you who are interested can explore it further, can discuss it with me also, that what were the natures of derivative and so on. Now, what it did is that look at the one of the simple derivatives. For example, let's first complete the example that we have taken. So what happens is that it allows many people to participate in the financial market, which otherwise would have found it difficult to actually participate. So I can participate in the financial market by buying derivatives. I don't have to buy shares. So I may not have the money to buy 10 shares, but I can bet on the value of 10 shares with very little money. So you have a lot of people who are actually investing in the share in the financial market, and they're investing the amount which is much more than their capacity to invest. So that is one thing which is happening. Is this point clear or not? I'm going pretty fast, but this is I really do not know how it can be covered all this, because this is really not directly part in your course. So but I thought that it is important, so wanted to discuss it. Is this clear what I'm talking? Is that clear? Any question you have? Any question? No? All right. So if that is the case, that
Sir,
yes.
so why are we saying that they're investing higher than their potential too?
No, you see, suppose I can actually bet on a share, value of a share. I can say that, look, I am going to actually buy this share from Pakiza, 10 shares from this Pakiza at 1,000 rupees. Now, Pakiza does not have those shares. Right now, the 10 share means that they may cost right now, if I have to buy anything between, because 900, 1,000 or 1,100 is the price of the share, something like that. So I require 9, 10, 11, 12,000 rupees for that. I don't have that much money, but I just may get into an arrangement with Pakiza. Now, if the price of that share is actually 900 rupees, and I had actually committed to buy it in 1,000 rupees. So essentially that means Pakiza can sell the shares in 900 rupees and sell it to me in 1,000 rupees, which means that I'm going to lose 100 rupee for each share, which means that the 1,000 rupees I am going to lose and she is going to gain. Now, it is not that she actually buys share and she actually buys share and sell it to me, but there is just an exchange of money between me and Pakija where I give her 1,000 rupees. So what is happening is that we are betting on the value of 10 shares of this particular company without actually having the need to buy that, because need to buy that means that I need that much of liquidity with me, which I do not have. So not the Pakiza has that kind of liquidity. So we don't have that kind of liquidity. Whatever liquidity we have, we could have actually used it to buy bet on only one value of one share, but we actually could do it for the 10 shares. Is this clear?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes. So that
Yes,
is
sir.
So, you have much more thing. So that is one part of it, that, this is in some sense how the fictitious money is generated through the contracts, that you really don't have to actually buy and sell shares. The second way in which one can actually look at it is that think of the simple thing, that the mutual fund. So what happens is that think of it like this, that there are 4 investment, and by investment I mean the real investment. So there are 4 different projects, and for 4 different projects I can actually invest in one project. I can buy one asset, and it has certain risk of failing. In which case I assess the risk, and accordingly I decide that whether I want to put my money or not, how much money I want to put in, and so on and so forth. Now, think of it that there are five such investments. Now, what a financial institution does is that buys the shares of all these five companies, five investment, mixes them up and makes an instrument and then sells it to me. And then it's tells me that, look, if you buy the share of one company and if it fails, then all your money is gone. But here your chances of failing is actually low. I mean, it's not that you are going to lose all your money. Because even if one fails or two fails, the other three will work. So you may not get the highest return, but then you are not going to get the zero return or the negative return also. So in that sense, what is happening is that the risk is getting minimized for me. Is it making sense what I just said? Anyone who does not, for whom it does not make sense? Yes? Okay. Tell me one thing. Is this definitely, in my eyes, it is reducing risk for me, and that's why I go for it? But is it a good thing or a bad thing that is happening? Is it a good thing or a bad thing from the point of view of the risk in the overall economy? See, what happens that I have certain risk appetite. What is my risk appetite? Yeah. Yes. Yes, someone was saying something? No.
Yeah, it increases the overall risk in the economy, because even though individuals as a whole are taking lesser risk, you're still investing in risky assets. So as a whole, the total risk in the economy is still increasing, because if there was no grouping of assets, then as an individual, I probably would never invest in a risky asset as a whole.
Yeah, so yes, that is entirely correct. In fact, for the very reason it is actually reducing the risk for me, it is reducing risk undertaken in the economy. And the story is like this. So what she said, I'll just repeat it. That essentially I have certain risk appetite, which means that I want to bet on money, I want to make more money, but then I also want certain money to be assured to me when I get old, let's say, that I must have this money. Now, what happens here is that this method, this new financial instrument, let's call it some kind of derivative or mutual fund or whatever, actually reduces my risk perception. So my risk perception is reduced. So I am now willing to undertake more risk, because I know that I have this mutual fund and I'm definitely going to get, out of five, even if the two actually fails, the three will remain. I'm going to get this much money in my old age. So my risk appetite is actually now, with the same risk appetite, I am actually willing to undertake buy more risky assets, which then gives the incentive for the financial institutions to actually finance more risky investment. So the total risky investment in the economy is going to rise, and this is happening while my risk perception remains the same, because I think that what I'm going to get in the at the old age, that is something which is not affected by it. So overall in the economy, the risk that is taken in terms of how many risky investments you undertake, that has increased. Returns also must be increasing. Typically the more risky investment would be sellable only if they give you a higher return. So the returns are also increasing. And people are generally actually not thinking that for them individually risk has increased, so they go on buying it, and financial institutions are also happily selling it, and this whole process continues because it is giving high return. And after some time, people actually forget that it could be actually quite risky, because for 7 years, 8 years, 10 years, if you have a run of this kind of boom, this kind of high return, then you even forget that something terrible can be happening, and a lot of risks are undertaken in the economy. Financial institutions do not have any problem, because they buy assets and sell it, they transfer it. So this is what is happening as far as the financial institutions are concerned, and for them, they are in that sense are not really taking any risk, but the people are taking risk. And overall, in the more important, overall, the riskiness if the economy actually increases. So when it comes, and then what happens that whenever there is a kind of, this creates a bubble, and whenever there is a kind of tendency toward bubble burst because of some external news, like, suddenly you realize that not all the dot-com companies which are created are going to survive. So a lot of money is going to, a lot of investment is going to be become bad investment. So in that sense, then there is a tendency to actually bubble to burst, the financial economy to actually go down. But then exactly at that time, the government actually comes in, pumps it more money, makes credit available to more people, deregulate further, allows even newer kind of instruments, allows the change in the rules, which allows banks to lend actually to the people whom otherwise it was not willing to lend, what we know as a subprime kind of credit creation, and then this boom actually continues. So this is how, in terms of the financial instruments that you see. So and what is happening is that there is certain logic to it, and that logic is following that you deregulate, and that deregulation allows you to undermine the risk that is taken in the economy, because it actually transforms your risk perception, and which then is going to make which means that in economy you have more risky investment, higher returns. So a boom is actually created. That boom brings in more people, and for some reason, whenever there is a kind of collapse of the system is seen as a possibility, then you do two things: A, pump in more money, and B, deregulate further. Allow even more type of instruments and so on, and that is how you are actually continuing with this boom. So when we talk of the regulation regime, that how banks work, how corporations work, how individuals are working, how the government is actually coordinating all these activities in terms of policy. So now you see that you have a completely new type of regulation framework that has emerged. In this regulation framework, the job of the Fed Bank is primarily to ensure that the boom in financial market at any cost is sustained. So whether you have high unemployment or other things is not what will determine what is going to be your credit supply. Your credit supply will be dependent on these things. So a complete change that has taken place now. So this is one part of this story. The second part of the financial liberalization story is basically the deregulation in terms of how institutions can actually function. So during the Glass-Steagall era, the Glass-Steagall Act was what actually caused the regulation of the financial sector after Second World War. So that this Glass-Steagall Act was slowly repealed, and financial sectors were deregulated, and the banks and the other financial institutions were allowed to undertake various other activities which they were not earlier. For example, you have universal banking, which is allowed, as different from the traditional banking and investment banking. So that these two used to be completely different things. Traditional banking, where you put money, deposit, lending, and so on. Having investment bankings, where those banks, which were essentially give the consultancy service, tell you that what is the best kind of investment for you, and so on and so forth. Now you allowed both types of banks to actually work together, or the traditional bank to actually undertake the investment banking activity also. The traditional banking, with the traditional banking, certain faith is associated. Because your father had put money into that, you are putting money into that, and you know that your money has always been safe. And when those people actually give you suggestion about where to invest and how to invest and so on, then that is taken as at a very at the face value, because people have faith on that. So you have the SBI mutual fund in India, which has a very little money that is being put here by the SBI. It is not that SBI is actually completely running it. It's a private organization, but the SBI bank employees would be actually given incentive. Sometimes it is carrot, sometimes it is stick. You have to actually achieve certain goal. So either way, and they are told that they have to actually sell this SBI mutual fund. And, so when a person actually goes to the bank and he knows the teller, and the teller tells him, why don't you do this, and this will actually be very good for you, I have done this, and my uncle did it, and so on and so forth. So this is how it kind of spreads. And of course that also involved a lot of fraudulent activity. What is that film on this thing? कौन सी film है वो?
The Big Short.
Pardon?
The Big Short.
Not The Big Short. This thing on this kind of how actually all kinds of fraudulent shares are sold. I think this.
Wolf of Wall Street.
Pardon?
Yeah.
Wolf of Wall Street.
Wolf of Wall Street. Yeah. So, that was something which was, in some sense, was a very, very real story. I really do not know about the lifestyle of the people, but what they were doing in business was something which is very, very real. So this is what is happening, and this is then giving rise to certain kind of financial boom. So we have 3 minutes left for this meeting. I'll take a break here, and I'll resume in 3-4 minutes, and then we can actually we'll have the next part of the lecture. All right.